Welcome back to Old School Sports and our Out of the Park Baseball 25 series. Can we save the Oakland A's? And our saving of the A's is not going incredibly well this season. We're 10 games behind in the AL West. The Rangers just continue to have our number in the division as they have over the last 2+ seasons at this point. And we are a percentage point behind the Tampa Bay Rays for the final wild card spot. We're in a flat-footed tie with them, and we've actually split the season series with them thus far, so not sure what exactly would happen if the season were to end today. But hopefully we will play better over the almost 80 games that we're still going to have left in this 2035 season. Not going to cover a ton of ground in this episode. We're only going to end up simming forward 10 games to the first year player draft, and then we're going to cut things off and take a look at some of the prospects that are going to be available for us with that selection. And if any of you have thoughts on which direction we should go, would love to hear them in the comments section down below. But I will say that I'm probably going to be posting this episode on Friday evening since it's very late Friday afternoon as I'm starting to do this episode. So if you're watching this episode by Saturday afternoon, it's possible I'll have already come out with the next one. So if you're in that situation, as I'm sure many of you will be, please don't break your head thinking about which direction we should go in the draft when it'll be conceivable by sometime relatively early Saturday that I've at least decided what to do. Before we get things started, I got a lot of interesting comments to the past episode that I'll touch upon quickly since there's not going to be a ton of moving forward in this episode as I talked about. Last time around, we've talked about potentially moving on from Kevin Stubblefield in the trade market, and I even mentioned that longtime third baseman Colt Keith is, for the time being, willing to waive his no-trade clause to some teams, and we could potentially move on from him before he is due a big bump in his salary next year of $7 million a season to $25 million that could be pretty difficult for us to handle given our likely budgetary constraints. I think I generally agree with the consensus of viewers. A lot of you kind of talked about this. Sir Valerian, YME943, Hijinks, Calvin Ha, Quiet Time, among others, opined on Stubblefield and Keith, and I think I am much more likely to move on from Mr. Stubblefield than I am Mr. Keith. If someone blew me away with a deal for Keith, or if we go 3-20 over our next 23 games and find ourselves in a very difficult spot to earn a fifth consecutive playoff this year, then maybe 4.5 weeks from now I'd think about trading Keith. But given that we are a win-now team, and he's a very important offensive player for us, although he's missed a good chunk of this season, unfortunately, I tend to think that I'll likely end up keeping Keith, probably trying to move on from Stubblefield, and will worry about whether or not Keith might be willing to waive his no-trade clause in the offseason, and also kind of see what we can get in return for him. I think we can get something decent in return, but I'm definitely not blown away by the initial options that seem to be out there. Speaking of Mr. Stubblefield, James mentioned that getting Stubblefield some more regular playing time could certainly help him be a more productive offensive player. And I definitely agree with James on that. But I kind of just feel like I'm done with Stubblefield, and I don't know who I would take out of the lineup for him. Right now he's playing for us against left-handed pitching, but he's got a 98 WRC plus over the course of his career and barely above a replacement level player. Looking at his splits against left-handed pitching, which is where we're playing him, he's at least been an above-average offensive player over the course of his career, although not the past 2 seasons. And righties, the opportunities have certainly been few and far between, but he's been below average against righties each of the last 3 seasons. I think James is right that there are players in the game that will be more effective when they're out there every day. And I think I've also seen in the past that guys playing a position in the field versus just DHing all the time from time to time has helped players as well. But for me to put Stubblefield into the lineup against right-handed pitching, we're basically looking at first base or DH, given his defensive limitations. And although Abraham Camacho is having a rough introduction to the major leagues this year, when I look at his batting profile, I don't see myself taking him out of the lineup for Stubblefield. And then Bobby Cabral has been our DH much of this year. With the recent injury to Luis Lara, Cabral has moved into right field, and we brought up Byron Brain to DH for us. Cabral, despite all of his limitations, has still been slightly above average offensively this year, and Brain 14% above average, if you believe WRC plus as a statistic. So although I don't love either Cabral or Brain, I don't think I take those lefties out of the lineup against right-handed pitching to give an opportunity to Stubblefield, who's basically a unplayable player if he's not hitting. And I agree, maybe he'd hit a little better if I played him more, but I don't think I'm willing to give him that opportunity at this point, particularly because we are trying to compete the best that we can. Speaking of Cabral and Brain, Patrick DeBronis brought up the fact that he doesn't like that kind of player and certainly wouldn't have 2 of them in his lineup. Similar to my response to James, I don't disagree with anything you're saying. I'd prefer to have 0 players with that low batting average, high strikeout profile in my lineup. But with this team and the way it's currently comprised, I think Cabral and Brain are decent options for us against right-handed pitching. As we talked about, they've both been above average offensive players thus far this year, even with Cabral's pretty slow start to the season. And John Hunter encouraged us to maybe give our backup catcher, Jaden Boakai, more playing time than the starter, Dave Ackley, noting that Ackley, with an 86 WRC plus, is not hitting much this year. And although he's a more than competent defensive catcher, he is not nearly as good defensively as Boakai. And Boakai has been an above-average offensive player this year. Again, I agree with the sentiment. This is one where I could see us giving Boakai a little more regular playing time. I've basically been starting him every 3rd day through the first 3 months of the season. Still interested in Ackley's bat. I think the fact that he's going to hit more home runs and draw more walks than Boakai over time is valuable, and hopefully we will see that in his offensive numbers at some point. Interestingly, and I pointed this out in the comments to John, if you believe in catcher ERA this year, Boakai with a 4.62 catcher ERA has actually been materially worse than Ackley, who's been 4.06, and they're catching for the same team, and they're 2 games on for Ackley, 1 game on for Boakai most times, so they should be basically receiving pitches from the same pitchers. Boakai is definitely a much better defensive catcher on paper, but this season he's gotten probably a bit unlucky compared to Ackley in terms of how he's managed the pitching staff. Probably more of a reason to give Boakai some extra playing time right now, since there probably will be some reversion to the mean given his excellent defensive skills. And the last comment I wanted to talk about was from Jackhammer Possessor. He was just kind of wondering what type of value Jake Ortega might have as one of the best players in baseball, who is signed to a very team-friendly contract at this point if he keeps playing at the level that he has been playing at. Jackhammer didn't necessarily say that he would trade Ortega for anything, and I tend to think I agree with that, but still interesting to look at. Just looking for a prospect package for Ortega, and given again that Ortega is one of the premier offensive, defensive, base running players in all of baseball, really a true five-tool player who, as I noted, is in the prime of his career at age 27 and signed to a very reasonable contract through his early 30s. Should have as much value as just about any contract and player in baseball. So I'm not going to allow the AI to include additional players when I look at a prospect package, and we'll just take a look at how grim the offers might be on these trade settings. I have a feeling I'm going to be a little bit disappointed, and you can see looks like there's a lot of offers out there. Ernesto Moreno is the cornerstone. Not all that exciting to me. I mean, we can get packages of several guys in their early to mid-20s for him. Large package from the Diamondbacks for him, including a 20-year-old catcher, Alexis Avalos. Pretty average defensively, still has a lot of work to do to become a major league hitter. Left fielder Luis Griego. So nothing to me that looks like it's going to jump off the page here. And we can get like 4 potentially useful major league players from the Mets for Ortega. But it doesn't look like anyone is willing to give some of the top prospects in the game until here I go. Maybe I lied to you. Number 166 prospect in Edgar Montoya from the Giants. They'd also send in first baseman Frank Ramirez, who looks like he could be the next Kevin Stubblefield with his profile. Center fielder Nelson Ayala. Respectable defensive corner outfielder with a little bit of pop in his bat. And then Edgar Montoya, 18-year-old international free agent signing from 2.5 years ago. If he reaches his full potential, still looks like he could be a pretty interesting offensive player, but not as good defensively, not as fast, and I guess if he reached his full potential with 65 contact and 65 power to go with above average gap power and eye, you could argue that offensively maybe he's more valuable than Ortega just because of the additional home run power, but the odds of an 18-year-old who's been a below-average offensive player 3 straight seasons in rookie ball and doesn't have any particularly special personality traits to boost his development, reaching his full potential is not an incredibly high proposition. Egidio Cobain, decent third base prospect, but I'm going to want a lot more for Jake Ortega than him. Juan Frere, 20-year-old number 78 prospect in baseball. decent speed, decent defensively, does have high work ethic and intelligence, but even if he maxes things out, he's got a bit more home run power than Ortega, but he's not near Ortega in the other three primary categories. So it's an interesting thought exercise, but I don't think something I'm really going to pursue all that aggressively. Looking for a single player. This is going to obviously provide us with much more at the major league level. A lot of interesting options for Ortega. Dane Grimm looks like he could be a excellent relief pitcher for many years to come. I don't know that I'm going to trade away a 27-year-old MVP winning center fielder for him. Jamie Bryant, second baseman, really like the glove, but the bat certainly nothing special. Like Ortega, he's also fragile physically. Eric Wingert, 25-year-old starting pitcher, does look like he could be a pretty good starting pitcher, a large, solid arsenal, and we think his stuff, movement, and control are all already above average and could get a little bit better. He's won 14 and 15 games the last 2 years for Cincinnati, but he's got a pretty bad personality, and he's also going to start making some pretty significant money these upcoming seasons. Right fielder Josh Esterly, 26 years old, not as good defensively, not as fast, and not a good hitter as Ortega. Does have that captain personality, and he's normal in terms of his injury proneness, but not a guy that I'd consider giving up for Mr. Ortega. And you can see as we can go through the rest of the list, I'm not going to go in excruciating detail, but for a 5-tool, 5-star type player like Mr. Ortega, the trade settings we're playing, I think any potential deal involving him would likely result in us losing some value, but always an interesting thought exercise to look at. So thanks to Jackhammer Possessor for encouraging us to take a look at that. And now it's time to kind of get rolling over this first month, week and a half of the month of July here until we do get to the draft, the middle of next week. We've got a home game against Cleveland, 2 on the road, or 2 at home against San Diego, and then we're on the road against Cleveland and Houston, as well as San Francisco, before we'll get to the All-Star break. But we're likely only going to be simming up through the middle of the series in Houston before we see where we stand and who's going to be available for us with our first round draft pick this year. Because we had a rougher regular season in 2034 than we did in 2033, I'm going to be picking a little bit earlier, number 26 this year, still certainly towards the end of the draft. And we don't have a supplemental first round pick this year, but we do get a compensatory pick at the end of the second round that was driven by the departure of Brian Ramos this past offseason. So we'll have 2 second rounders, and then we'll also be picking 26th overall. So we'll see who's on the board for us in the not too distant future. And kind of really funky here, the Twins with the first 2 picks in the draft. Whew. That is a extremely rare position for any team to find themselves in Major League Baseball, where there's no draft pick trading. I'm willing to bet that it's never actually happened before, but if I'm wrong about that, I'm sure someone will let me know. And we lost the first game of the month to Cleveland. Something that some of you may have seen that I meant to mention at the end of the last episode. Joe Lewin, who you may remember, was a first round pick of ours, is a high school pitcher that we traded away a while back, just won the NL Rookie of the Month. Lewin for this year in Philadelphia, 5-3 with 8 saves. He started 8 games, and he's obviously closed out at least 8. 3.61 ERA, striking out a batter per inning, and looks with his profile like he can maybe be a little better than we thought he could peak at when we traded him away just about 3 years ago at this point. Lewin was in the original trade where we brought Brian Ramos on board as a rental for the first time with us. So certainly ended up being a relatively expensive rental perhaps of Ramos, especially that season where he ended up getting hurt. Devin Saltiban no longer in our organization. Jesus Vargas is 20-year-old in rookie ball. He's been respectable there, but certainly doesn't look like he's going to reach the types of heights that Mr. Lewin has. So that trade may come back to haunt us a bit for years to come. But anyways, on to the pop-up that I mentioned. I wish I had just turned the video on when I had the pop-up there, but I thought I might get an email about it. But owner John Fisher has changed his priority from win now to balanced. Unfortunately, he's still expecting us to win the championship this year, so I don't know that really helps us over the near term. But it sounds like over the medium to long term, the 74-year-old pitcher may be a little balanced as far as winning now versus playing for the future versus maximizing profitability. And our A's definitely remain in a bit of a malaise. We split the 2-game homestand against the Padres, and then we lost 2 out of 3 in Cleveland after winning the opening game of the series. So 47-43 record, 12.5 back in the division, and we are now 2 games out of the wild card. Jake Ortega continues to run a lot in addition to hit a lot this year. Although Ortega's batting average is down to .314, but tied for the second in the American League with Jason Dominguez with 22 stolen bases. We'll see what happens over these next couple of games, maybe before we do the draft review. We'll also just check in as to whether there's anybody particularly different or interesting on the trade block. Don't think we're going to see a ton of movement there since it's only been less than 2 weeks since the last time we checked in, but you never know. And another loss to start off the series at Houston. Jake Ortega now a little banged up, a mild ab strain, but given that it impacts both hitting, throwing, and running, and he's already fragile physically, we're going to just sit him out the next few days. Not going to put him on the IL because we will at least hopefully have him back for the last couple of games before the trade deadline, before the All-Star break if we don't put him on the IL. So we'll just bench him and run a player down for the next few days. But the team hasn't been good this year, and keep in mind the projection was that this was a 100-win team when we ran the simulation at the start of the season. So we have definitely underperformed what we thought we had on paper and on the computer screen. And another loss to Houston, so we're going to have to take 2 in a row on the road just to salvage a split in that 4-game series. And then 3 left against San Diego before the All-Star break. So we're continuing to fall apart. We've lost 4 in a row at this point, 13.5 back in the AL West. and we are 3 out of the final wild card spot here. So this month of July, not off to a impressive start for our Oakland A's. I'll take a quick look at the trade block as we talked about. Jackson Holliday out there. He would certainly be a very helpful guy to bring on board. Harry Ford, interesting catcher. Brooks Lee, pretty good defense. Decent looking bat. Our old shortstop Cameron Cawley. Yordan Alvarez still kicking around at the age of 38. Luis Lujan always seems to be on the trade block, given some of his negative personality traits, but a bat that could certainly help, despite the negatives of Mr. Lujan. That's a pretty potentially impressive bat coming off of a year when he led the league in homers, and he's having another big season this year in the last year of his contract. Guessing the price for him is going to be pretty high, and we would also need them to retain a pretty good chunk of his contract. So there's a fair amount of guys that they would trade for him, some of the better prospects in our system and some of the better players on our major league team. Interestingly, they wouldn't trade him for Jake Ortega, which seems absolutely insane to me. Wonder what they think about our good friend Mr. Stubblefield. I'm guessing he's not going to have a ton of trade value. Yeah, kind of looks like even if we put Stubblefield in the list, into offer, the list of guys that they would accept for him, more or less unchanged, perhaps exactly unchanged. So not a ton of value for Stubblefield. I guess we can shop Stubblefield again. We've done this just about a week and a half ago in Game Time in the previous episode, so I'm not expecting it to look materially different for Mr. Stubblefield. We can get a couple of injured relievers, one of whom's out for the year, and Alex Clemmy, and one of whom may be back in August in Ryan Lautos. So just not a ton of value for Mr. Stubblefield at this point, unfortunately. We'll go back to the trade block and just take a quick look at some of the pitchers who may be available as well. Jackson Jobe, most highly regarded, at least according to our scout, in terms of his current ratings and his future ratings. Looks like a good, solid reliever at this point. Put up a 4.12 ERA this year. Basically been a league average kind of guy, slightly above replacement level value. Making a lot of money this year with the Mets, and importantly, $11 million next year as well. I would think that the price for him should be pretty low. Maybe that's because we just didn't have them retaining enough that they would only take Ferris for him. No. Mets seem to have a bit of a inflated view of the value of Jackson Jobe. I mean, he's going to be 33 in a few weeks, fragile physically. He's kind of a jerk, at least in this world. And he's been a league average-ish pitcher this year. His profile suggests, to be fair, he should be better than that. But I think they may be asking a bit much for him. So we are obviously going to have a lot to think about as far as the trade deadline and what we want to do to improve this team. And I'm going to spend a fair amount of time between right now and the next episode thinking about the trade market and investigating a lot of things in addition to thinking about the draft. But right now we will turn our attention to the draft. As I mentioned, we're picking 26th. Not going to do a deep dive on any of the potential players available right now, but we will go back in just a moment and look at who the Twins took with the first 2 picks of the draft. But starting the draft, we'll auto pick until Oakland. Take a look at the draft log now. And the Twins with a couple of high school starting pitchers, 1-2 overall in the draft. Boy, their GM is looking to find a job in the Oakland A's organization with that kind of decision making. And we'll have to compare it to this short starting pitcher, Mike Gallick, out of North Carolina, who went 6th overall. A guy with a potential 4-pitch arsenal, good personality. Looks like he could be a pretty solid major league pitcher in the not too distant future. But the Twins with the 2nd overall pick went with Danny Raymond. Looks like he's only a 3-pitch guy. And he's got a lot of work to do with the sinker and the cutter. But we think his stuff, if he reaches his full potential, could be absolutely devastating. Excellent stamina, excellent at holding on runners, and we think the movement and control could both be well above average as well. Interesting prospect, lefty, got a long way to go, and they took Luis Hawley, number 1 overall, potential 4-pitch arsenal, good stamina, also excellent at holding on runners, some positive personality traits. Another guy who we think stuff, movement, and control could all be well above average. So lefty as well. I don't dislike either of the starting pitching prospects that the Twins took 1-2. I think, and I've talked about this in the past, sometimes with high school pitchers, it's just a numbers game, whether you're bringing them into your draft with the first 2 picks in the draft, a first-round pick and a second-round pick, or a 4th-round pick and an 8th-round pick sometimes. If you get enough of them into your system, you will hit on some of them, particularly if you've got good coaching and have a big investment in player development as well. But quite honestly, even if I was in love with both of those high school guys, I think just in terms of conservatism and not rolling the dice quite as much, if I was going to go with pitchers, I might have taken one of the 2 of them and then maybe thrown in the college guy, Mike Gallick, instead, because he's got a pretty high ceiling also in terms of his potential, and a much higher floor than those guys, given that he's 22 years old and a lot more developed. But I'm sure we will find out in the years to come whether Hawley and Raymond work out. If those 2 both work out, we could be seeing the Twins in the World Series on a regular basis about a decade from now. But we will turn our attention now to the players who we can actually think about picking with our 26th pick in this 2035 draft. There's 6 position players who are above 4-star potential, according to our scout. Center fielder Mike Zamaran, very impressive and pretty well balanced potential batting profile. Not a ton of speed, not that great defensively, and also not that smart. With the 26th pick, the upside is certainly tempting if he reaches his full potential. But I hope there'd be a better option for us than Zamaran as we go through some other options out there. Second baseman Jerry Stanton, pretty interesting potential bat, potentially 65 contact, 65 home run power. Another guy who's slow, not all that impressive defensively. Third baseman Gene Hartman, high adaptability and work ethic, low financial ambition, unfortunately also low intelligence. Definitely has a third baseman or first baseman defensive profile. Potentially excellent home run power, potentially a pretty good eye. Got a lot of work to do making contact. but not a horrible prospect. Ryan Britt, another third baseman. Not quite the same kind of range, but another guy with potentially really interesting home run power, an above average eye. Speed is average-ish. Don't hate either of these third basemen, but they're somewhat interchangeable to me on first look. There are two five-star potential guys, one of who looks like he might have the worst personality in history, and that's right fielder Jim Kenney. Low leadership, loyalty, adaptability, work ethic, and intelligence, but at least he doesn't have high financial ambition. A very interesting hitting profile if he met his full potential, but with that personality and being an older high school guy closing in on 19 years old, I don't think that's the direction I'd be inclined to go. That personality alone and the additional difficulty it's likely to result in terms of him reaching his full potential, probably enough in and of itself to turn me off. Darnell Selvey, center fielder, another five-star prospect, pretty average speed, decent range, although he's not a particularly gifted defensive outfielder. He's all about the bat, potentially 65 contact, 70 power, and 65 eye if he reaches his full potential. I can't say I'm in love with any of these guys. Selvey's maybe the most interesting to me, but again, I've literally spent no more time on any of these guys than the last 5 minutes that I've spent walking through them. So it's very possible when I spend more significant time looking at these guys and where their ratings are, where their potential is in all of the various different categories, and think about their personalities more, that I might have a more refined view. But I think maybe leaning towards Selvey-ish right now. And there's a big pool of pitchers to pick from as well. We know that there's been some pitchers that have gone pretty high in this draft, but hopefully there's still some interesting talent on the board. We'll take a look at a bit deeper pool here, just because there's only 3.5 star guys. So we'll look at the 4-star guys as well, along with a couple of college pitchers who have higher floors but perhaps lower ceilings. Rob Schmeising, committed to Duke. Potential 5-pitch arsenal if everything went well. Impossible to sign. I think his stuff could be absolutely devastating, but pretty mediocre movement and control potential. Mixed personality traits. Hard to believe, even for me as a high school pitching guy, that's the direction we'll go with the 26th pick. Jeff Rudd, another starting pitching prospect, only a potential 3-pitch arsenal. Stuff and movement maybe a little above average. Think his control is really good. Low leadership, loyalty, and work ethic. High adaptability and intelligence. Another kind of mixed personality. Elijah Roberts, potentially 6 pitches, but who knows how many of them ultimately develop. Do like the high leadership and work ethic, decent stamina, pretty good at holding on runners. Think he could be a bit above average in everything. I don't think his stuff is necessarily as high end as Schmeising or Rudd, but I think if I was going to go with one of these guys, maybe Roberts over them. Dan Jorgensen, another 18-year-old, potential 4-pitch arsenal. Potential really nice stuff, average movement and control. Throws in the mid-90s already, so a little harder than some of these guys. Reliever Devin Drymon, I'm guessing he's not going to be all that interesting. Looks like he could be a darn good reliever, but with that 25 stamina and only a 2-pitch potential arsenal would be a pretty onerous task to turn Taz into a starting pitcher, even with a lot of good success in the development lab and talent change randomness. There are, as I mentioned, though, 3 4.5-star pitchers to think about. Chris Roberts, 17-year-old, potential 5-pitch arsenal, good stamina, really good at holding on runners, high work ethic, wants to get paid, ultimately could have really good stuff, average movement plus control if everything worked out. Dudley George, 3 to 4 pitch guy, good stamina, good at holding on runners, some negative personality traits. Another guy who's all stuff. I think his movement and control could, in a perfect scenario, be a bit above average. And last, but hopefully not least, among the pitchers available is Chad Evans, 18-year-old, closing in on 19 years old. Another one of the guys who's a little bit older, does have high leadership, adaptability, and work ethic. Decent stamina, decent at holding on runners, potential 4-pitch arsenal, but it's going to be reliant on the changeup developing to get there. I think his stuff and his control could both be well above average if he reaches his full potential, but movement only average. Good at keeping the ball in the park, but not necessarily all that great at avoiding hard contact that results in consistent hits. So kind of an interesting profile there. I did mention that there's also a couple of college pitchers who are 3.5-star potential, who are a little further along in their development. So we'll take a look at those 3 as well. Actually, they're not all necessarily that far along in their development, but I would assume they're a little further along than the high schoolers. Mike Ramirez, 21-year-old, 4 pitches that aren't far off major league quality. I think his stuff and his movement could both be a bit above average, average control, great stamina, not all that good at holding on runners, out of Franklin Pierce University in New Hampshire. Jim Benson, 22-year-old, out of Indiana State. Oof. 3-pitch arsenal at best, and a couple of the pitches are borderline major league quality at best. Decent stamina, decent holding on runners, some positive personality traits. I think his movement and control could both be a little above average if he completely develops, but his stuff is pretty pedestrian. Benson is durable, though. And Kevin Anderson, out of Vanguard University in Costa Mesa, California. Potential 4-pitch arsenal, but another guy whose stuff is pretty underwhelming. Think he could have average movement, a bit above average control. A lot of positive personality traits, but honestly, I don't know that I'm in love with any of these college guys right now. I don't think I'm really in love with anyone here at pick number 26. So we will give it some thought, do a much deeper dive, look at some guys that aren't necessarily as high ceilings as the players we've looked at, and see if we can come up with something else interesting to maybe do here at number 26 overall. If those of you who are willing to serve as members of our worldwide scouting department have some ideas, would certainly love to hear them. And if you've got ideas on what we should consider doing in the trade market, would love to hear those as well, because we've definitely got some work that I feel like we need to do with this roster to ensure that we do guide this team back to the playoffs here in 2035. At this point, we're only 2 games above 500. And as we talked about, 13.5 out in the division, 3 out in the wild card. So we've got some work to do over the final 2.5 months of the season. And as I said, I'm going to spend a fair amount of time offline, not just perusing the trade market in terms of the trade block, but looking if there might be any other options available, particularly if we get creative with the likes of Stubblefield and maybe Keith. And who knows, if someone blew me away with what we could get from Ortega, have to be willing to think about anything. But I'm pretty confident that 3 weeks from now, when we are past the trade deadline, if there's one thing that I'm confident in, it's that Jake Ortega will still be on this roster unless he, knock on wood, ends up hurt. Until our next episode, thanks so much for watching, and hope you have a great day.